So I've been doing a lot of thinking about what happened at the end of Loki season 2 episode 4, and I want to discuss something that I was thinking about going back to season 1 of Loki and going back to what was said in other MCU projects to try to make sense of a lot of this. So I created this little diagram here, and I'm going to explain what all of this means here in a minute and give you what I think is going on. Now understand that in the next episode coming up this coming Thursday, this might not even apply anymore. It all depends. I think I may have gotten it right. I think I may understand, but we'll see what Marvel gives us. So, first and foremost, I want to say that I have had a bit of a misunderstanding, and I think a lot of you may have too, about what's really going on with Loki when it comes to the story and when it comes to what actually was said by He Who Remains at the end of season 1. Before I go any further, I want to let you know that this is going to contain spoilers for Loki up until this point. So if you haven't been keeping up with Loki, obviously this video is not for you because, episode 4 had a big cliffhanger ending. So there you go, you've been warned. So episode 4 of season 2 ended with the infamous Loom, the time loom that crunches the sacred timeline and the branches together exploding. Now, in order to really understand how all this works, you have to go back and look at what He Who Remains said and look at also what the Ancient One said to Hulk in Endgame. So, what I used to think, mistakenly, wrongly, is that the sacred timeline was created to contain the multiverse and and that He Who Remains won the previous multiversal war, which he actually said that he did, thanks to the creature that can eat universes and eat timelines and whatnot, and of course Ravonna, and that I had thought that the sacred timeline was just one timeline, and that's not the case. If you actually look at Loki, both season 1 and 2, when you see the sacred timeline, there's little branches coming off of it everywhere. And they explain early on, Miss Minutes explains that whenever there's a branch that goes in a direction it's not supposed to go, the TVA steps in to delete the timeline. Now, the reason why this is being done by, well, really it was by He Who Remains. We thought it was by the Timekeepers until the finale of season 1, is because he doesn't want any alternate versions of himself to exist. However, based on the events that happened with the Avengers in Endgame, which in season 1 Ravonna said was part of the plan, the sacred timeline is not just one timeline. That's why I wrote sacred timelines. The sacred timeline is actually a multitude of different timelines that make up one universe. See, what I was thinking, and I think a lot of you may agree, and we'll talk about this a lot in the coming weeks, I'm sure. So this is not like a finalized explanation, but it's one that I'm trying to give you all right now to kind of get the information together, is that each branching timeline creates a new universe, but that's not really what happens. And you have to go back and look at not only He Who Remains, what he said, but also what Immortus said in the mid-credit scene of Ant-Man. I'm going to go over all that here in just a minute, so be patient with me. So, because of the events of Endgame, we know there are multiple branching timelines that are still out there, unless, of course, the TVA prune them. Now, the TVA did prune the timeline of Loki, that alternate 2012, but there's still an alternate 2014 with no Thanos. Remember, Thanos from 2014 came to 2023, and so 2014 was left without a Thanos, without his army, and without Gamora and Nebula. Now, that timeline may have been pruned, but it was not really shown to us. However, we do not know if in that timeline there existed a version of Kang the Conqueror. Remember, the He Who Remains' entire goal is to prevent there being another multiversal war, to prevent there being incursions, and to prevent more copies of himself. Now, if you look at the diagram here on your screen, I wrote that the blue line there curved is the sacred timelines, plural. Because now that He Who Remains was killed at the end of season 1, there are more branches coming out. Now, why is this important? Because I think the way that this works is the Loom is meant to contain all the timelines into one sacred timeline. So if you look at it, think of it as being multiple different time strings. Like just look at like your clothing when you have strings coming off of it and they're all strung together. There's multiple strings sort of tied together in like a batch. Sort of like when you have, a coaxial cable or if you guys are tech guys, RJ45, like an Ethernet cable. You've got multiple little cords inside of one cord, right? That's kind of what's happening here. Now, he who remains his job was to keep all of that tight to prevent it from getting out of control. However, if you go back and listen to what he said at the end of season 1, he said he did not say that he destroyed the other universes. That he did not say. He never said that. I think many of us assumed that he was talking about that. He said that he isolated, that he separated the sacred timeline from everything else, which means that at some point, everything was touching, all the multiverse. And if you look down here, you see multiverse. I basically use these little blue circles to illustrate different universes. There's way more than just, I wrote like 7 circles, but there's way more. It's just a diagram. Now, what He Who Remains did, I believe, is separate the sacred timeline and keep it away from the multiverse. So the multiverse has always been there. And the multiverse itself contains aspects of the Marvel cinematic multiverse, like the Sonyverse with the 2 Spider-Men, Tobey and Andrew. Even the Spiderverse. See, you have to understand, the Spiderverse exists within the multiverse. The Spiderverse is just a cluster of universes where Spider-Man exists. And we know this from watching not just Doctor Strange 2, but other time travel stories in Marvel and What If, that with the other universes, they're not all the same. You're going to have Captain America, Captain Carter, different versions and variants of Loki, Captain America, Iron Man, Ultron, all these characters, but some universes just don't have them. Some universes don't have Spider-Man. So what Miguel was trying to do in Spider-Verse is sort of do what the TVA is doing and make sure that, and what the He Who Remains is doing, and make sure the Spider-Verse portion of the multiverse, the cluster of universes that have Spider-Man in them, to protect them. So he's kind of doing what the TVA was doing on a smaller scale for the Spider-Man multiverse, the Spider-Verse. However, the sacred timeline exists outside of that. It's Earth 616. However, there's a Spider-Man in Earth 616, which means that it has to be in Miguel O'Hara's, computer system that there's a Spider-Man there. Now, I'm not trying to confuse. Let's go back to this. So, I believe He Who Remains separated the sacred timelines to make sure they did not interact with the multiverse, because interacting with the multiverse, what that would do is it would cause not only incursions, but more copies of himself to appear. And we know that Kang the Conqueror has hundreds, if not thousands, of different variants of himself, because he likes to play around with time travel. That's in the comics, and that's also in the MCU. Now, one thing we have to make clear is that the way that I said that the sacred timeline has multiple different strands, each multiverse also has its own strands. So you may have a universe that's not 616 that has multiple versions of Kang, because there's going to be branching timelines in the main timelines. There's tons of branches. And I think what He Who Remains was trying to do is keep the sacred timeline away from the multiverse, because if the sacred timeline were to be out of control, it would interact with the multiverse. What did Immortus say? Go back and watch it. It's on YouTube at the end or during the mid-credit scene of Ant-Man. He said they're beginning to touch the multiverse. What's happening is with Doctor Strange's spell, with America Chavez, and I want to go over this in detail in just a moment, and with what's going on with Loki, the sacred timeline is falling apart and starting to bleed into the multiverse. So the sacred timeline here is starting to unravel so badly that it's going to mix in with the rest of the multiverse, and that's where the other Kangs can come through. The way I see it is that those other Kangs have always been there. It wasn't like He Who Remains killed them all. They've always existed, but they have not had access to the sacred timeline because He's kept that sacred timeline away from them. But now that the Loom was destroyed in episode 4, that may have in turn connected 616 with the rest of the multiverse, and now we have a real problem. What happened in Doctor Strange and what happened in Spider-Man No Way Home, that was just a small appetizer of what's really going on now, which is the Loom has been destroyed. Now there's no order anymore. Now, when I say things like, well, the other Kangs have always been there, some of you guys are going to say, well, no, they haven't. They weren't there until He Who Remains died. You have to think about this fourth dimensionally. Now, try to follow me here because this is kind of confusing. When it comes to time, both in string theory and some scientific practices and scientific theory, as well as in the MCU and other time travel stories, time is not a linear path. There is a sacred timeline, but the way things work with time is we're not given a direct chronology because with time, everything exists at once. I know that sounds weird, but what I'm trying to explain with that is just because Ant-Man 3 came out in February with Kang the Conqueror and with the other Kangs appearing in the mid-credit scene does not mean that it takes place before Loki. Don't get confused. I believe that Loki season 2 takes place after Loki season 1, but before Ant-Man. Because they're giving these movies and these shows to us in a certain order, but because we're talking about time travel, that does not mean that they're actually happening in that order. Meaning, because the other Kangs existed in the previous multiversal war, that means they're still there in the previous multiversal war in the past. But remember, we're talking about timelines and time travel. Because they already exist, it means they always exist. And because they have access to time travel technology, okay, maybe they lost the previous multiversal war, but they're still there because there are so many branching timelines. Does this make sense? Am I confusing you guys? I'm trying to make it real simple here. Time travel stories of this magnitude are very, very nerdy, and they make sense only to like big geeks like me and you guys. And even I'm not 100% sure on some of this stuff because it is so, so deep, and you have to really sit here in deep thought. To understand this, the way time works is to understand that with access to a time machine, time is no longer linear. Meaning that you could, with a time machine, let's say that you get into a time machine right now. And it's let's say right now it's Saturday, October 28th. You can go into a time machine, like Kang, for example, go into a different universe in the multiverse, and it could be Monday, January 12th. You can go wherever you want to go. And so time might pass linearly with your body and how you age, but you're jumping around different parts of the timeline. You understand? You're moving all over the place. You're going to the beginning, the end. You can go anywhere you want. So because of that, we know that the Kang story began in the 31st century. Obviously, the stuff we're seeing now in Loki does not take place that far to the end of time, except for the stuff at the Citadel at the end of time. And we know that the other Kangs have access to the multiverse because we saw it in Ant-Man. So I think the Loom exploding is actually what leads into the events of Ant-Man. Because remember, the quantum realm exists everywhere. The quantum realm can be accessed. And the quantum realm, that by itself is a mind fuck. Because the quantum realm, once again, exists outside of time. And so because of that, that's why you have wonkiness and spaghetti stuff and all that. So you have to look at, in order to understand Loki, you have to look at it not from, well, this event leads to this event, leads to this event. These events have already happened. The Loom has already exploded. Literally, the Loom exploding, right, is what created this big problem. Along with, of course, Sylvie killing He Who Remains. However, if you want to go even deeper into it, He Who Remains, like he said at the end of Loki season 1, he said, the path that you walked, I paved the road. He knew what was going to happen. That's why Victor Timely was a backup plan. And one of the big theories that I've heard is that when Victor Timely died at the end of Loki season 4, when he became Spaghetti Strands, what actually happened was, with the Loom exploding, his DNA, his temporal essence spread throughout the multiverse, and that's what birthed all the different Kang the Conqueror variants. And the reason why He Who Remains knows this is because he already saw this happen already. This has already happened. It's a repeat. It's a loop. And by the end of Avengers Secret Wars, they're going to have to figure out a way to break the loop. I know this is a difficult video for y'all to understand because it's difficult for me to place into words. Hopefully you know what I'm talking about. But when thinking about time travel, yes, the Loom exploded at the end of the last episode, but that does not mean that's happening right now. That does not mean that The Marvels, which comes out next month, takes place after it. That does not mean that Captain America 4, coming out next year, takes place after it. The Loom exploding already happened before. And now that the Loom exploded, there's going to be so many timeline branches that it's going to dysregulate the sacred timeline and blend it in with the rest of the multiverse. And that's how the Kangs will have access to the sacred timeline now, which is where we're going to see the Kangs invade the main MCU universe. Does that make sense? I think it does. Let me know your theories down below, and we'll talk soon.